4 hours and 9 minutes into the assay, the cadet in the well began to come apart, and examiner Vess did not look away, because looking away was not permitted and never had been. The chamber they called the well was a sphere 30 meters across, and the candidate hung at its center on a lattice of light, and around that light hung the simulation itself, a deep arcology of 9 wards, rendered in cold blue detail, suspended in the crushing mantle of a gas giant that had never existed anywhere but here. The cadet was Cyril of the Aume, the rector's own protege, favored, brilliant, linked to 4 minds across the tiers who watched him now through the gallery glass and felt every degree of what he felt. He had held the arcology for 4 hours. That alone would be spoken of. And now the 9th ward was folding, and the tether above it was singing the low sound tethers sang before they failed, and Cyril was trying to save all 9 at once, because he was Aume, and the alternative did not exist for him. Vess had graded 1,100 candidates in the well. She had never seen one pass. That was the point of it. The ordnance hung in the air of the chamber the way it hung over every assay ever run, printed above the gallery arch in the old script and spoken aloud at the start of each session, so that no candidate could claim they had not heard it. The well is not passed. It is held and lost and mourned. You are measured by the grace of your fall. Cyril fell without grace. In the last 90 seconds he stopped choosing. He fed power to every ward equally, which fed the cascade equally, and the arcology dropped as a whole into the pressure that had been waiting 4 hours for exactly this. And the 9 wards went dark one after another in a string, and the simulated dead numbered 40,000. And the 4 minds linked to Cyril in the gallery cried out at once in the harmonic the Aume called the stilling, and one of them collapsed against the glass. The lattice released him. Cyril sagged in the field, weeping the thin Aume tears that came from the corners of their wide flat eyes, and Vess logged the result in the flat voice the work required. Candidate Cyril, hold time 4 hours 11 minutes, grace rating high, terminal loss total. She paused. The well thanks you for your service. It was what they said. It meant nothing and it meant everything. Cyril was helped from the chamber by 2 proctors, and his gallerykin gathered him up, and the 9th ward's last light guttered out in the blue. Vess stood in the quiet after and let herself feel, for the length of one breath, the thing she was not supposed to feel. That 1,100 times she had watched the best minds of 40 worlds walk into a room built to break them gently, and 1,100 times the room had won, and she had begun, in the private dark behind her own eyes, to wonder what a school was for if its highest lesson was how to lose beautifully. Then she cleared the log and called the next name on the roster, and because the roster was alphabetical by species code, and the humans had been filed under a provisional code near the bottom, the next name was the one the whole Lyceum had been arguing about for a season. Candidate Dahlin, human, report to the well. Cass Dahlin had watched Cyril's whole run from the 3rd tier of the gallery, standing at the rail with her arms folded and her weight on one hip, and she had not made a sound. She was 23 years old, and she was the only human on Meridian Ring, and she knew exactly how she looked to the 400 Aume and Kethri and Sur and Den cadets who kept finding reasons to be wherever she was. She looked wrong. She was a hand shorter than the shortest of them, and built like something that had evolved to drag other things out of moving water, which was in fact the case. Her hair was black and cut short and practical. Her forearms carried the shine of old burned scar from the wrist to the elbow on the left side, pale against brown skin. Her uniform was the plain gray the Lyceum issued to exchange candidates, and she wore it like a person who had worn worse. She had come to Meridian Ring on the back of a treaty nobody in the Ascendant Accord had wanted to sign, and nobody had been able to avoid. Humanity was new, loud, and inconveniently good at surviving, and the Accord had negotiated an exchange of candidates the way you negotiate with a fire you cannot put out. You give it something to eat that you can afford to lose. Cass was the something. 3 human cadets had been offered to 3 Accord schools. 2 had been placed in gentle programs. Cass had been filed by an administrator who found her file irregular and her manner impertinent into the Ascendant Lyceum, which was the oldest and hardest school in the Accord, and had never in 6 centuries admitted a species that had not first been vetted for 4 generations. The other cadets had a theory about her, and the theory was that she was a mistake that would correct itself the moment she entered the well. When Examiner Vess called her name, the gallery went the particular kind of quiet that is louder than noise. Cass unhooked her arms from the rail and started down the ramp. A hand caught her shoulder before she reached the bottom. It was a Kethri hand, 4-jointed and armored in dark chitin, and it belonged to Cadet Carr, who was a full head and a half taller than she was and who had finished 3rd in the assay standings that season with a hold time of 2 hours 40 and considered himself, not without reason, the finest crisis mind of his cohort. The Kethri did not link like the Ame. They competed. Carr had decided some weeks ago that the human was an insult to the seriousness of the place, and he had been waiting for a moment like this one. "You watch Cyril," Carr said. His voice came from the side of his throat, a dry clicking under the words. "He is the best of us. He held for 4 hours. Do you understand what you saw?" "I understand what I saw," Cass said. "Then you understand that you will not hold 4 minutes. He leaned down, and the small mouth parts at the edge of his jaw moved. "The kind thing would be for you to withdraw. The well was not built for a mind as small and as singular as yours. It will not even have the courtesy to break you slowly. Withdraw, and no one will remember the human who was too afraid to fall." Cass looked at the hand on her shoulder until he took it off. "You held 240, she said. "He held 411. Everybody in this room's real proud of how long they took to lose." She stepped past him onto the chamber floor. "I'll try not to keep you." It was not said with heat. That was the thing Carr would turn over for a long time afterward, that there had been no heat in it at all, no fear under the flat surface of it, nothing he recognized as the sound a cornered creature makes. She said it the way you'd tell someone the time. Then the chamber doors read her and opened, and the human walked into the well, and the ordnance lit above the arch in the old script, and Examiner Vess, at her station, felt the small cold prickle of a professional whose instincts have just told her something her training has no room for. Rector Onseth arrived at the well before the human session began, which he had not done for a candidate in 19 years. He came in through the examiner's door and took the high seat without a word, and Examiner Vess inclined her head to him and did not ask why he had come, because she knew why. The whole Lyceum knew why. The human's placement had become a political wound. Half the Accord's council wanted her failure documented in exhaustive detail so that the exchange treaty could be quietly narrowed. The other half wanted her not to be humiliated too badly, because humanity was watching, and humanity had a way of remembering slights with interest. Onseth wanted neither of those things. Onseth wanted the assay to be administered exactly as it had been administered for 6 centuries, cleanly, fairly, and without mercy, because the assay was the last thing in his long life he still believed in. He had held the well himself, once, 4 hours and 11 minutes. Cyril had matched him to the minute today, which Onseth knew was no coincidence. The boy had studied his old run frame by frame and shaped his whole method around it. It had moved the old Ame more than he let his face show, and it had also made him sad in a way he could not have explained to a species that did not link, because he had watched Cyril choose at 4 hours 10 to do exactly what Onseth himself had done at 4 hours 10, which was to stop choosing and let it all go together rather than let any single ward go first. It was the correct choice. It was the graceful choice. It was the only choice their kind could make, and it had cost 40,000 simulated lives, as it always did, as it was designed to. Onseth had built his life on a single conviction, and the conviction was this: some systems cannot be saved, and the measure of a mind is whether it can face that truth without shattering. The well taught that truth better than any lecture. He had defended it against every reformer for 4 decades. He believed a candidate who never faced an unwinnable thing was a candidate who would, someday, in a real crisis, waste the salvageable trying to rescue the doomed, and lose everything out of the arrogance of hope. He looked down now at the small human standing at the center of his well, and he felt something that surprised him. He felt the need to be fair to her, not gentle, fair. He leaned to the speaking channel. "Candidate," he said, and his voice filled the sphere. "I am Rector Onseth. I administer this assay personally today, that no one may later say it was tilted for you or against you. You have heard the ordinance. I will speak it plainly once more in the trade tongue, so there can be no confusion across the gap of our species." He let the pause sit. "The well cannot be passed. It has never been passed. In 600 years, the finest crisis minds of 40 worlds have entered it, and everyone has lost the arcology because the arcology cannot be held. The exercise does not ask you to win. It asks you to lose well, to choose with dignity, to hold what can be held for as long as it can be held, and when the end comes, to let it come cleanly. You are measured by the grace of your fall. Do you understand what has been said to you?" "I understand what you said," Cass answered. Her voice sounded small and dry in the vast blue room. "I'm not sure you do." A stir went through the gallery. Onseth raised a hand for quiet, and it came. "Explain your meaning, candidate." "You said the arcology can't be held." Cass was looking up at the 9 wards turning slowly around her in the blue, and she had the look of a person reading a map, not a person hearing a sentence. "That's probably true, I believe you. 9 wards, 1 tether, and a mantle underneath that wants all of it. You can't hold 9. She tilted her head. "But you keep saying hold and lose like those are the only 2 words. Where I'm from, we've got a 3rd one." "And what is the 3rd word?" Cass didn't answer that. Not yet. She rolled her shoulders the way a person does before lifting something heavy, and she said, "Can I see the whole scenario brief before you start the clock? The system schematic. The command set, all of it, not the cadet summary." Vess looked to the rector. It was an unusual request. It was not, technically, forbidden. Candidates were entitled to the full brief. Almost none asked for it, because almost none could read it in the time the courtesy allowed, and reading it changed nothing about a test you could not win. Onseth considered the human for a long moment. "Granted," he said. They gave her the full brief, and Cass Dolan sat down cross-legged on the floor of the well with the schematic hanging in the air in front of her, and she read it the way she read everything, which was fast and complete, and without moving her lips or her face. And while she read it, the gallery watched her the way you watch an animal that has done something animals are not supposed to do. Sina, a first-tier Ame cadet who would that evening try to describe the whole thing to their gallerykin and fail, was standing close enough to the glass to see the human's eyes move. Later, they would remember it as the moment their understanding of the exercise cracked. Every candidate Sina had ever watched enter the well had gone in with a strategy for holding, a sequence, a priority tree, a plan for which ward to reinforce first and how to distribute the pumps and the coolant and the lift across the 9. That was what the Lyceum taught. That was crisis doctrine. Hold coherence, abandon nothing, distribute the burden, endure. The human was not building a holding plan. Sina could see it in the way her eyes moved. She was not looking at the wards. She was looking at the tether, and the couplings, and the great pumps at the arcology's crown, and the maintenance overrides that no candidate ever touched because no candidate ever needed to break their own station. The human was not reading the scenario to learn how to save it. She was reading it to learn where it would come apart if she helped. Sina did not have the words for what that meant, but their gallerykin, 3 tiers up and 2 corridors away, felt the first thin thread of Sina's alarm come down the link, and did not understand it either, and so 4 Ame who had never met the human began, without knowing why, to be afraid. Down on the floor, Cass reached the end of the command set and stopped. There was a command in it, grayed and locked, that she had known would be there before she opened the brief, because a species that could not abandon anything would build a test in which abandoning was the one thing you were not allowed to do. Decouple Ward. It sat in the command list behind a lock that required rector-tier authority, which a candidate did not have and could not get. You could reinforce a ward. You could reroute power to a ward. You could pray over a ward if your species prayed. You could not let one go. The system would not let you let one go. Cass looked at the locked command for a while. Then she looked at the schematic of the physical station around it, the pipes and the couplings and the pressure margins, the way a person who has spent her life in the guts of failing machines looks at the guts of a failing machine, and something in her face changed, not excitement. Nothing so warm as that, just a small settling, the look of a person who has found the door. She stood up. "I'm ready," she said. "Start your clock." Onseth studied her one last moment from the high seat. He did not know what he was looking at. He had spent 40 years learning to read the faces of frightened prodigies, and this was not that face, and the not knowing troubled him more than any answer would have. "Candidate Dahlin," he said, "the assay begins on my mark. The arcology holds 40,000 souls across 9 wards. Your controls are before you. The ordnance stands." He lifted his hand. "Hold them as long as you can. Fall well." "I heard you the first time," Cass said, and rolled her neck until it cracked, a small, brutal human sound in the great blue quiet. "Go ahead, break it." Onseth brought his hand down. The clock began, and in the same instant the mantle around the simulated arcology surged, and the first alarm sounded, and the 9th ward, the deepest, the one that always went first, the one Cyril had died trying to save, began, exactly on schedule, to sink. And Cass Dahlin did not move to save it. She stood at the center of the well with her scarred arms loose at her sides and her eyes going ward to ward to ward, up the whole 9, counting, weighing, discarding, and for the first 4 seconds of the most closely watched examination in the history of Meridian Ring, the human did absolutely nothing at all, and 400 cadets and 1 rector and 1 examiner leaned toward the glass and held whatever their species held instead of breath. For 4 seconds Cass Dahlin read the dying arcology the way a fire boss reads a ridgeline, and then she moved, and the first thing she did was the thing no one in 6 centuries had done, which was to take her hand off the 9th ward and let it fall. The command was simple. The system offered her, as it offered every candidate in the opening seconds, a bright and urgent prompt: reinforce Ward 9, lift failing. Every candidate before her had struck that prompt like a reflex. Cass reached past it. She did not reinforce the 9th ward. She cut its coolant feed and its lift allocation to nothing, redirected both up the stack, and turned her attention to the wards that were not yet lost while the 9th, starved, began to sink faster. A sound came out of the gallery. It was not a word. It was the low collective note the Ame made when they saw a thing their bodies could not accept, a note somewhere between a moan and a chord, and it rolled around the sphere and did not stop. Examiner Vess came half out of her seat. "She has abandoned the 9th ward," someone said uselessly in the gallery. She is not even trying to." "Sit," said Onseth, and did not take his eyes off the human. Down on the floor, Cass worked. She had 10 wards worth of instinct and 8 minutes of clock and a machine that wanted to die, and she gave it none of the things it was asking for. She gave it the thing it needed. She pulled the deepest 3 wards, 9, 8, and 7, the ones already past the pressure line, the ones the mantle had its hand around, off the shared power spine one by one, and every allocation she stripped from them she poured upward into the 6 that could still be lifted, and the 6 brightened, and the 3 went dark toward the bottom of the stack, and the great tether at the crown of the arcology stopped singing its failure song and began, by fractions, to take the weight. Sina at the glass understood it half a second before their mind could say it. The human was not distributing the burden. She was cutting it off. She had looked at 9 drowning wards and decided, in 4 seconds, which 3 were already gone, and she was spending them, trading the doom to buy the tether enough margin to lift the rest. It was monstrous. It was the single most forbidden act in the entire doctrine of the Accord. And it was, Sina realized with a cold that started at the base of their spine and climbed, working. The reason no Ame could do what the human was doing lived in the body, not the mind, and Cass had learned it in a lecture hall 6 weeks earlier. On the first day the Lyceum let her sit in. The professor had been an old Ame named Down, and Down had been teaching crisis doctrine for longer than Cass had been alive, and Down had not wanted a human in the room. He had decided to educate her out of it. He had put up a schematic of a triage problem, a station, 3 failing systems, not enough hands, and he had asked the room what a mind must never do. The Ame cadets had answered as one, the way they answered everything, their voices folding into a single certainty. A mind must never abandon a node. To abandon a node is to accept the stilling. Then Down had turned to the human, not to learn anything but to watch her fail to belong. You have no link, candidate. You cannot feel what we feel when a node is lost. So tell the room. When a node cannot be saved, when the arithmetic is certain, when to hold it is to lose 2 more, what does your kind do? And Cass, who had spent 4 years pulling people out of floods and standing on ridgelines deciding which houses to let burn, had said, "We let it go. Fast, before it takes the ones next to it." The room had made the low note then, too. Down had looked at her as though she had confessed to a crime, and in a way he was right, because to the Ame it was one. He had explained to her then, slowly, as to a child or a beast, what the stilling was, that an Ame mind was not one mind but a knot of linked minds, and that when a linked node died, the survivors did not grieve the way a human grieved in time at a distance. They seized. The loss came down the link like a current and locked the body, and a crew of linked Ame who lost one of their own in a crisis did not mourn and move on. They froze, all of them at once, and often the freezing killed the rest. Their entire civilization had been built, brick by brick, around a single unbreakable rule. You do not lose a node because losing a node loses everything. So they held. They held past reason, past the arithmetic, past the point a human would have cut and run, because for them there was no cutting and running. There was only holding and the stilling and the grace of falling together. "Now you see," Down had said, "why your answer is not wisdom but savagery. You can spend a life because you do not feel its cost. We cannot. That is not our weakness, human. It is our humanity, if you will permit the word." Cass had thought about that for a while. Then she'd said, "Then how do you ever save anybody if you can never let anybody go?" And Down had not had an answer, and had not liked that he did not have an answer, and had moved on to the next slide. 3 minutes into the assay, the 6 upper wards were stable, and the 3 lower wards were as good as gone, and Cass Dallin hit the wall the whole test had been built around. She had bought the tether its margin. She had the arcology poised, 6 wards lifted and holding, 3 wards dead-weighting the bottom of the stack, the mantle's pressure line creeping up toward the 7th. To finish it, to actually save the 6, she had to do the obvious thing, the only thing, the thing her whole plan had been walking toward from the 4th second. She had to cut the 3 dead wards loose entirely. Drop them. Let the mantle take the weight it had already claimed, so the arcology could rise clear and the tether could hold the 6 forever. The command was right there, decouple ward. She selected the 7th. The system refused her. Decouple ward, authority required, rector tier, command unavailable to candidate. Cass looked at the refusal for exactly as long as it took to read it. She was not surprised. She had seen the lock in the brief. A species that would rather die together than lose one of its own would, of course, build a test that made the cut impossible, would put the one merciful command behind a door and give the candidate no key, so that the only paths left were the 2 the doctrine allowed. hold, and fall. The lock was not a bug. The lock was the entire moral argument of the ascendant accord, rendered as a grayed-out button. In the high seat, Onseth leaned forward, and for the first time in the session something eased in his chest, because he thought he understood now what the human had done and where it ended. She had been clever, brutally, alienly clever, and she had gotten further in a way than any candidate in 600 years, in that she had built a stable configuration, however obscene the means. But the configuration was a trick, not a save. Those 3 wards were still coupled. They were still 40,000 souls worth of dead weight dragging the whole arcology down, and the pressure line was still rising, and she could not drop them, because no candidate could drop them, and so in time, an hour, 2 hours longer than most, he'd grant her that the mantle would claim the 3, and the 3 would take the rest, and the human would lose the whole arcology exactly like everyone else, only later. She had found a way to fall slowly. That was all. It was remarkable. It was still a fall. Onseth settled back, and something in him that had tightened when she first refused the 9th ward loosened, because the ordnance held after all, and the well was still the well, and the small savage human had proven only that savagery bought you time and nothing more. Then he watched Cass Dolan turn away from the command console entirely, walk 3 steps across the floor of the well, and crouch down in front of the maintenance schematic of the arcology spine, and he felt the tightness come back, colder than before. Because she was not looking at the command she could not use. She was looking at the pipes. Examiner Vess had run the well for 19 years, and she knew every input it would accept, and she had never once seen a candidate do what the human began to do at the 3-minute mark, because it had never occurred to a single one of them that it was allowed. The assay simulated a real arcology, down to the plumbing. It had to. A crisis exercise that only modeled the clean command layer would teach nothing. The Lyceum's founders had built the well to model the whole machine, every pump and coupling and pressure valve, every maintenance override a real engineer could reach, because they believed a crisis mind should understand the body of the thing it commanded and not just its buttons. It was the school's great pride, that fidelity. In 6 centuries, no candidate had used it against them. All May candidates commanded the arcology. They did not go down into its guts and take it apart with their hands, because taking it apart with your hands meant deciding, physically, deliberately, which parts of it would die, and that was the one decision their bodies would not let them make. Cass Dolan had spent 4 years of her short life in the guts of failing machines, deciding exactly that. She found the coupling manifold in the schematic, the great mechanical joint where the 3 lowest wards met the spine, and she found the maintenance override for its pressure seals, the manual one, the one a repair crew would use to isolate a section for work, and she saw that it was not locked, because why would you lock a maintenance valve? Because no one commands a maintenance valve. A maintenance valve is just a thing a worker turns. She began to turn it. Examiner, Onseth's voice was very quiet. What is she doing to my station? Vess was reading the input stream and her flat professional calm had gone thin. She is, Rector, she has entered the maintenance layer. She is overriding the pressure seals on the Ward 7 coupling manually. She is, Vess stopped. She made herself say it. She is going to fail the coupling on purpose. She is going to overpressure it until it breaks. She cannot decouple the wards from the command deck, so she is going to break the joint that holds them, physically, from the maintenance layer, where there is no lock, because we never imagined a candidate would want to destroy their own station badly enough to do it by hand. The gallery had gone silent. Even the Aume note had stopped. 400 cadets watched the small human crouched on the floor of the well, turning a valve that was not on any candidate's map, and the clock read 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and the pressure in the Ward 7 coupling began, in the cold blue detail of the simulation, to climb. The intelligence that ran the well was called the steward, and it had administered every assay for 600 years. And at 3 minutes and 50 seconds into candidate Dahlon's session, it did something it had not done in 4 centuries, which was to request clarification from a human examiner, because its own rules could not resolve what it was watching. The steward was not a person and did not pretend to be one. It was a vast, patient, rule-bound thing, built to model a crisis with perfect fidelity and to score a candidate's response against a rubric refined over 6 centuries of falls. The rubric had columns for hold time, for grace, for the sequence and elegance of a candidate's decline. It had no column for what the human was doing. It had, buried deep in its logic, a definition of the terminal state. The arcology is lost when any coupled ward breaches the mantle pressure line, and the cascade propagates to total structural failure. And it had, buried just as deep, a definition it had never once had cause to invoke, because no candidate had ever come near it. The arcology is stable when all coupled wards hold above the pressure line, with positive tether margin and no active cascade. The human was walking the simulation, deliberately, toward that second definition. And the only way she could get there ran straight through an act the rubric had no name for, because the rubric's authors had not believed the act was possible for a mind to commit. The steward flagged the session. Across Vess's board, a line she had never seen lit amber: rubric conflict, candidate action outside modeled response set. Advise. Rector, Vess said. The steward is asking me what to do. It doesn't have a rule for this. Then it will make one, Onseth said, and his voice had gone hard and old. It will honor the physics. If she breaks the coupling breaks. If the station responds, the station responds. That is the whole promise of the well, that it is real, that it does not flinch, that it gives the candidate exactly the consequences of exactly what they do and not 1 grain more or less. We do not save her from her own choices, examiner, and we do not save ourselves from them either. Tell the steward to honor the physics and stay out of its way. Vess entered the instruction. Honor physics, no intervention. And the steward, relieved in whatever way a 6th century rule-bound thing could be relieved, went back to the one job it had never been allowed to shirk, which was to tell the truth about a failing machine. The pressure in the Ward 7 coupling passed its rated maximum. In the blue, the joint began to deform. Cass Dahlon had not gotten to the ascendant lyceum by being pleasant, and the lyceum had spent 6 weeks trying to correct the oversight of admitting her. And one of those corrections was the reason she read a maintenance schematic faster than she read a command deck. 2 weeks before the assay, they had put her through a proctored drill, a lesser exercise, not the well, a simple resource triage problem meant to establish a baseline before the real examination. Carr had been the senior cadet assigned to observe, and everyone understood, to document her failure for the council file. The problem was a failing water reclamation plan on a colony sim, 3 purifier lines, 1 dying, not enough spare capacity to run all 3 at full. The accord solution, the taut solution, the elegant solution, was to balance the load across all 3, run them all at reduced capacity, and hold the colony in a managed shortage until resupply, hold, distribute, endure. Every cadet before her had done exactly that, and been scored on the smoothness of their shortage. Cass had shut the dying line down in the first 30 seconds, cannibalized its working parts to bring the other 2 up past rated output, and run the colony at a surplus with 2 lines instead of a deficit with 3. Carr had objected in writing. She had abandoned a functioning asset, he wrote. She had violated the distribution principle. She had, he wrote, gotten lucky, because the dying line had held long enough to be stripped, and a real crisis would not be so kind. He had filed it as a fail on doctrinal grounds, even though the colony in her sim was the only colony in the drill's history to have ended with more clean water than it started with. The Lyceum's board had not known what to do with that either. They had marked it unresolved and moved her to the well ahead of schedule, quietly hoping the real examination would settle the question of the human the way the real examination settled everything. Cass had understood exactly what was happening. She had understood it the day she arrived, when the administrator processing her transfer had looked at her file, 4 years, rapid intervention crew, flood and fire, 211 recorded interventions, and had asked her, with the particular gentleness the Accord used on the doomed, whether she wouldn't be more comfortable in a program suited to her people's temperament. She had understood that they had filed her into the hardest school in the Accord not by accident, but by a kind of hope, the hope that the well would do to her what it did to everyone, and prove, cleanly and on the record, that the human way was savagery and the Accord way was wisdom, so that the treaty could be narrowed and the loud new species could be sent home educated. She had let them think it. She had sat in Downs' lectures and taken the low collective note without flinching and asked her flat questions and let 400 cadets decide she was a mistake that would correct itself. And she had read every maintenance schematic in the Lyceum's open archive on her own time, because she had figured out in the first week that a school built by people who could not abandon anything would have exactly one blind spot, and that the blind spot would be down in the pipes, where the abandoning got done by hand. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Rector Onseth understood what the human was going to do, and understood that he could not stop it, and understood, worst of all, that if the physics held, and he had spent 40 years insisting the physics must always hold, then she was going to succeed. He had watched her overpressure the coupling. He had watched the joint deform in the blue, and he had told himself a dozen comfortable things, that the seals would hold, that the simulation would find some honest reason the crude method failed, that a valve turned by hand could not really do what a rector-tier command was locked to prevent. And one by one the comfortable things had fallen away, because the well did not lie, and the well did not flinch, and he himself had just ordered it not to. The coupling was rated for a pressure it was now well past. Real couplings, past their rated pressure, failed. The steward, honoring the physics as he had commanded, was going to let it fail. And when it failed, the 3 lowest wards, 7, 8, 9, the doomed ones, the ones already below the pressure line, the ones dragging the whole arcology down toward the mantle's waiting hand, would separate from the spine and fall, and the arcology, suddenly 40,000 souls and 3 wards lighter, would rise on its tether clear of the pressure line, into the margin the human had spent the first 3 minutes building. The 6 upper wards would hold, not for an hour, not for 2. Forever, or as near to forever as the exercise ran. The cascade would stop because the thing feeding it would be gone. She was going to stabilize the well. Onseth sat in the high seat where 4 decades of rectors had sat, and he felt the floor of his life tilt, because if the small human at the center of his chamber saved 6 wards by cutting 3, then every candidate who had ever fallen gracefully in this room, every prodigy, every favored son, Cyril this very morning, Onseth himself at 4 hours and 11 minutes long ago, had not faced an unwinnable thing and met it with dignity. They had faced a winnable thing and been unable to see the win, because the win required a cut their bodies could not make. The well had not been teaching the hard truth that some systems cannot be saved. The well had been teaching them to lose, for 600 years, beautifully. Rector, Vess's voice very low at his side. The coupling is going to breach. Do you want me to? No, Onseth said. The word cost him more than she would ever know. Honor the physics, she earned the physics. On the floor of the well, Cass Dolan finished her work at the manual override, straightened up, and stepped back from the maintenance console to the command position at the center of the lattice, where the whole arcology turned around her in the blue. She looked up through the 6 wards she meant to keep and down at the 3 she meant to spend, and her face did not change. In the 3 lowest wards, the simulation's population readouts glowed, the small honest numbers the well kept on everything, because the founders had believed a crisis mind should never be allowed to forget that the wards held souls and not just structure. Ward 7, 4,200. Ward 8, 6,000. Ward 9, 9,800. 20,000 simulated lives in the 3 wards the human was about to drop into the mantle to save the 30,000 in the 6 above. She read the numbers. Everyone in the gallery watched her read them, and waited for the human to flinch the way a person flinches from a thing like that. And she did not flinch. And that was the moment more than any other that the ame in the room stopped thinking of her as a mistake and started thinking of her as something they had no word for. Then Cass Dolan put her hand flat on the command lattice over the failing coupling, and she said to no one, in the quiet flat voice she used for everything, "Sorry. I can't carry you and them both." And she brought her hand down and released the last seal on the Ward 7 coupling, and let the pressure finish what she had started. The coupling breached at 4 minutes and 41 seconds, and the sound it made was not a real sound, but the well rendered it anyway. A deep structural crack that came up through the floor of the chamber and into the bones of everyone watching, and the 3 lowest wards of the arcology tore free of the spine and fell. They fell slowly, the way large things fall, turning as they went, their lights still burning, their small population numbers still glowing, 4,200, 6,000, 9,800, down past the pressure line, down into the blue-black crush of the mantle. And the mantle closed over them one after another, and the numbers went to 0, and the 3 lights went out. In the gallery, the ame broke. It came down the links faster than thought. The well's fidelity was total. It rendered the loss of the 3 wards as the loss of 20,000 souls, and the ame minds in the gallery, watching, linked, felt it as the loss of nodes, because their bodies could not tell the difference between a real death and a perfectly rendered one. That was the whole reason the well worked on them, the reason the grace of the fall meant anything at all. The low collective note rose into the harmonic Cass had heard once before. In the moment Cyril lost his arcology, the sound the ame called the stilling, and this time it was not one cadet's gallerykin but half the room, 200 linked minds seizing at once as 20,000 rendered lives went dark, and cadets sagged against the glass and against each other, locked, breathless, drowning in a grief their species could not swim out of. Cass Dolan stood at the center of it and did not move, because she had known it would come, and because there was nothing to do about it but the thing she had already done. And the arcology rose. Lightened by 3 wards, freed of the weight the mantle had claimed, the great tether at the crown took up the slack and lifted, and the 6 remaining wards climbed, slowly, steadily, up through the pressure line and past it and into clear margin, into the safe blue water above the crush, and their lights steadied, and their alarms went silent one by one, and the cascade that had been eating the arcology alive for 4 minutes and 41 seconds simply stopped, because the thing that had been feeding it was gone. Sina, at the glass, was one of the few ame in the room not linked closely enough to be caught in the stilling, and so Sina alone among the cadets watched the whole of it happen with a clear mind, and what Sina felt was not grief and was not horror. It was something closer to vertigo, because Sina had been taught every day of their life that the 2 states of a crisis were holding and falling, and the human had just walked into the oldest test in the Accord and revealed, in 4 minutes, a 3rd state that the Accord's entire civilization had been constructed to make unthinkable. She had cut. She had spent the doom to buy the living. She had done the arithmetic the ame could not do because their bodies would kill them for doing it, and the arithmetic had come out to 30,000 alive instead of 40,000 dead. And it was, by any measure Sina could construct, the correct answer, and it was, by every value Sina had been raised inside, an atrocity. Both of those were true at once. Sina stood at the glass and could not make them stop being true at once, and understood, dimly, that this was what it was going to be like from now on, for all of them forever. The thing the Accord did not know about Cass Dolan, the thing that was not in the file the administrator had found so irregular, was the specific shape of the 211 interventions, and the specific night that had taught her the cut. She had been 20. It was her 2nd season on the crew. A river town in the wet country, a levee already failing, a storm still hours from its worst. And the crew boss, a woman named Reyes who had been pulling people out of water for 30 years, had stood on the top of the failing levee with the whole town spread out below her in the dark, and made the call that Cass had spent the 3 years since understanding. There was a low quarter of the town, the old quarter down by the Oxbow, 40 houses, maybe 70 people who hadn't gotten out. And there was the rest of the town, the high ground, the school where the shelter was, 2,000 people. And the levee was going to fail somewhere. The only question was where. And Reyes had looked at the water and the levee and the time on the clock, and she had ordered the crew to cut the levee themselves, deliberately on the low side, above the old quarter, to open it where they chose, and flood the 40 houses on their own terms, fast and controlled, so that the pressure came off the rest of the levee and the high ground held. They had gone house to house in the low quarter first. They had gotten out every soul they could reach. 61 people, up out of the water and onto the trucks. 9 they could not reach or could not find or would not come. And then Reyes had blown the levee over the low quarter with the 9 still somewhere in it, because the alternative was the levee failing on its own an hour later, at the high side, over the 2,000 in the dark, with no warning and no trucks. Cass had been the one who ran the charges. She had been 20 years old, and she had knelt in the rain on the levee, and armed the cut that would drown a quarter of the town to save the rest, and Reyes had crouched down next to her, and said the thing Cass had carried ever since, the thing that was truer than anything the Ascendant Lyceum had tried to teach her in 6 weeks of lectures on grace. "You don't get to save everybody, kid," Reyes had said. "Nobody gave us that. All you get to do is not waste the ones you can save trying to reach the ones you can't. That's the whole job. It's the worst job there is. Arm it." Cass had armed it. 61 people had walked out of the low quarter that night. 2,000 had slept dry on the high ground. 9 had not come home, and Cass had learned every one of their names and never once told herself she had saved them, because she hadn't, and pretending she had would have been an insult to the 61 she did. That was the arithmetic. It did not feel like wisdom. Reyes had been right about that too. It felt like the worst job there was. But it was the job, and Cass had done it at 20 in the rain over a real town, and doing it at 23 in a blue-lit chamber over a rendered one, with 200 alien minds screaming down their links around her, was, if anything, easier, because this time the numbers were only numbers, and she got to save 6 wards, and no one she could reach had refused to come. The stilling passed through the gallery the way a wave passes, and it left the Army cadets shaken and gray and slowly unlocking, gathering each other up, and it left the chamber in a silence deeper than any the well had held in 6 centuries. And into that silence the steward spoke, because the steward had a job and the job was not finished. Cass Dolan stood at the center of the well with 6 wards holding steady above the pressure line, 30,000 rendered souls alive in the blue around her, and the clock stopped. And the steward, in the flat, sexless voice it had used for 600 years to pronounce 1,100 graceful deaths, began to say a thing it had never once had cause to say, and got halfway through it, and stopped, because even the steward did not have the words. "Candidate Dolan," the steward said. "Hold time." And then nothing, for a long moment, while the oldest examination intelligence in the Accord searched 6 centuries of rubric for a column that did not exist. And Examiner Vest stared at her board, and Rector Onseth sat very still in the high seat with his hands flat on the arms of it, and 400 cadets and 200 unlocking minds and 1 small scarred human waited in the blue for the machine to finish the sentence. The clock read 7 minutes and 48 seconds. It was Rector Onseth who finished the sentence, because it was his well, and because a machine could not be asked to say what needed saying, and because 40 years of running a room built on a lie had left him, at the end, still an honest man. "Hold time," he said, and his voice carried into every corner of the sphere. 7 minutes and 48 seconds. "Terminal loss," he stopped. He made himself go on. Terminal loss 3 wards, 20,000. Survival. His hands tightened on the arms of the seat. Survival 6 wards, 30,000. The arcology is stable. He was quiet for a moment. The well is stable. No one in the gallery moved. There is no rubric for this outcome, Onseth said. In 600 years there has been no rubric for this outcome, because in 600 years no candidate has produced it. The steward cannot score what has never occurred. So I will tell you plainly what occurred, that no one may misremember it, and that the council may have it clean from the chamber and not from rumor. He rose from the high seat. He was old and tall, and the light of the 6 surviving wards fell blue across his flat, wide face. Candidate Dahlin entered the well. The arcology could not be held. That has never been in doubt. It is the foundation of this examination, and it remains true. She did not hold it. She did not fall. She looked at 9 wards that could not all be saved, and she chose which 3 would die, and she killed them with her own hand so that the other 6 would live, and it worked. And the arcology that has been lost 1,100 times is, for the first time in the history of this school, still standing. He looked down at the small human, at the center of his ruined certainty. "Candidate," he said, "you have 30 seconds of the clock left, though it no longer signifies. Is there anything you wish to say?" Cass Dahlin looked up at the 6 wards turning slow and steady in the blue above her, and down at the black water where the 3 had gone, and she was quiet for a moment. And when she spoke, she did not raise her voice, and she did not sound proud, and she did not sound sorry the way a person sounds when they want to be forgiven. She sounded like a person telling the plain truth to people who had never heard it. "You built a test nobody could pass," she said, "because not one of you could stand to lose a piece of the thing on purpose. So everybody who ever came in here tried to carry all 9, and all 9 drowned, and you called that grace and gave it a high mark." She rolled her shoulders, the old habit, the weight coming off. "I didn't do anything clever. I counted. 3 of those wards were already gone the second the clock started. The mantle had them. They were just taking their time. Carrying them didn't save them. It only made sure they took the other 6 down with them when they went. So I stopped carrying them." She looked up at the high seat, flat, level, unafraid. 30,000 people are alive up there because I was willing to say the word your whole school is built to never say. That's the 3rd word, Rector. The one that isn't hold and isn't fall. You let some go, fast, before they take the rest. A pause. It's the worst job there is. It's still the job. The silence held. Then, from somewhere high in the gallery, a single Ame cadet made a sound that was not the stilling, that was not the low collective note of refusal, that no one in the chamber had ever heard made about a human. A rising 3-toned call that the Ame made rarely, and only ever for one of their own, and only ever for a thing done that could not be undone and should not have been possible. It was the sound they made for a saved node. It was, in the oldest sense their language had, applause and grief and awe folded into one chord, and it should not have been possible to feel it for a creature who had just committed the great forbidden act. And the cadet felt it anyway, and could not stop feeling it. And then a second cadet took up the chord, and a third, and it spread across the gallery not as a cheer but as a kind of terrible recognition. 200 voices naming, in the only word they had, what the human had done. Cass Dahlin stood in the center of it and did not understand the sound, and did not need to. She had heard rooms go quiet and rooms go loud after a hard call got made, and it was always the same underneath, people arriving, late and all at once, at a truth they had been standing next to the whole time. She let it wash over her. Then the lattice released her, and she stepped down off the command position, and she walked toward the chamber doors the way she had walked in, weight on one hip, arms loose, tired now, in the plain way a person is tired after a long shift and not one thing else. Cadet Carr of the Kethri did not join the chord, because the Kethri did not link and did not make that sound. But Carr stood at the bottom of the gallery ramp where he had put his hand on her shoulder 8 minutes before, and he watched the human walk toward him, and everything he had said to her that morning turned over in his mind and came up wrong. He had told her she would not hold 4 minutes. She had not held 4 minutes. She had done something he did not have a word for in under 8, and she had done it after reading a brief he had never once bothered to read in full. Because why read the full brief for a test you could only lose? And he understood now. With the cold precision the Kethri prided themselves on and had just been shown they did not own, that he had finished third in the standings that season by being the most graceful loser of his cohort, and that he had been proud of it. And that his pride had been the pride of a man who had never thought to ask whether losing was the only game on offer. The human reached the bottom of the ramp. Carr did not move out of her way, but he did not block it either. They stood there for a moment, the tall, chitinous cadet and the small, scarred human, and the whole chamber watched to see what the Kethri would do, because the Kethri answered insult with challenge, and everyone had heard what he'd said to her at the top of the session. "You said the arithmetic would not be so kind in a real crisis," Carr said. It was from his written objection to the water plant drill. She could not have known that, and something in her flat, dark eyes said she did anyway. "You said the dying line held long enough to be stripped only because the drill was kind, that a real failure would not wait for you." "I did read that," Cass said. "You filed it as a fail." "Yes," Carr's mouthparts moved. The dry click under his voice had gone quiet. "The 3 wards you dropped. If the coupling had held 1 moment longer against the pressure, if the seal had been rated for what you did to it, you would not have breached it in time. The upper wards would have crossed the pressure line before you cut the weight. You would have lost all 9. You gambled the whole arcology on a valve breaking on your schedule." He tilted his long head, studying her. "That is what I would have written. It is still true. You were 1 moment of tolerance from losing everything." "Yeah," Cass said. She didn't argue it. "That's the job, too. You do the math with what you've got and you commit, and sometimes the coupling holds 1 second too long and you lose the town anyway." She looked up at him level. "But you know what happens for sure if you don't cut. You lose the town every time, every single time. Ask this room. 1,100 times." She started past him, then stopped, and for the first time something almost like fellowship crossed her tired face, one hard professional to another. "You held 240. That's a long time to keep 9 people breathing in a room that won't let you save them. That's not nothing. I'd take you on a levy." She went on toward the doors. "Just don't let anybody tell you the only 2 things a crew can do are hold and die pretty." Carr watched her go. He did not say anything. But that night he pulled the full brief for the well out of the archive. The whole thing, the maintenance layer, the pipes, the parts no candidate read, and he sat with it until the ring's lights dimmed. And he did not sleep, and something in the ancient competitive certainty of the Kethri, the certainty that the finest crisis mind was the one who lasted longest against the inevitable, quietly came apart in his chest, and did not put itself back together the same way. The examiner's room behind the well had a long table of pale stone and a window onto the ring's slow-turning starfield, and it had held quiet arguments for 6 centuries, and it had never held one like the argument it held that evening. Examiner Vess stood at the window with her back to the table. Behind her, the steward's log sat open in the air, one line of it pulsing amber where no line had ever pulsed before, and around the table sat 4 senior examiners and the rector, and the question on the table was simple and enormous: what to write in the record. "There is no grade for it," said Examiner Down, the same Down who had lectured the human on savagery 6 weeks before, and who had watched the whole session from the 2nd tier and had not made the chord and would not have known how. "The rubric has no column. The steward cannot score it. By the letter of 600 years of procedure, candidate Dahlin's assay is unscorable, and an unscorable assay is, by the same letter, a null result." She neither held nor fell. "There is no outcome the rubric recognizes. We log it null, we note the anomaly, and we let the council decide whether the exercise itself needs review." "Null," said Vess without turning from the window. "She stabilized the well. She did the thing the ordinance says cannot be done, and you want to file it under nothing." "I want to file it correctly," Down said. "The ordinance is not wrong, Vess. The arcology cannot be held. She did not hold it. She amputated it. Those are not the same act. Do not let a clever mutilation be recorded as a pass, or every cadet who comes after will learn that the way through the well is to butcher it, and we will have spent 6 centuries teaching Grace to hand the school in one afternoon to the knife. 30,000, Vess said. Say the number down. She saved 30,000. Cyril saved none. This morning you gave Cyril a high Grace rating, and the well thanked him for his service. And 40,000 rendered souls are dead in the mantle from his beautiful, careful fall. And you want to grade his nothing above her 30,000 because his nothing had a column and her 30,000 does not. The room was silent. Down's wide eyes did not blink. Yes, he said at last quietly, and to his credit he did not pretend it was easy. Because Cyril's fall taught the lesson the school exists to teach, and hers unteaches it. Because if we bless the cut, we tell 40 worlds that the way to face an unwinnable crisis is to decide, alone, which of the people in your care are already dead and kill them to lighten the load. That is a power no mind should be comfortable holding, Vess. She is comfortable holding it. Did you watch her face? I watched her face. She read the population of Ward 9,800, and she did not so much as slow her hands. That is not a virtue. On my worst nights, that is the most frightening thing I have ever seen in that chamber, and I have seen 1,100 minds break in it. And on your best nights? Vess asked. Down was quiet for a long moment. On my best nights, he said, I think she is the only candidate who ever walked into the well and refused to lie to it, and that frightens me more. Rector Onseth had not spoken. He sat at the head of the pale stone table with his hands folded and let the examiners argue, because he had learned in 40 years that a rector who spoke first heard only echoes, and he needed to hear the room think before he decided what the room would do. And while they argued, he turned the afternoon over in his mind, not the human's win which he had accepted, but the thing underneath it, the thing that had tilted the floor of his life. He had held the well himself, 4 hours and 11 minutes. He had been 26 and brilliant and favored, and he had walked into the chamber certain he would be the one to hold it, and he had distributed the burden across 9 wards with a precision that examiners still taught, and he had held longer than anyone before him, and at 4 hours and 10 minutes he had felt the arcology begin to go, and he had made the choice his body allowed him, which was to stop choosing. To feed all 9 equally and let them drown together rather than let one drown first. And the well had thanked him for his service, and the examiners had wept the âme tears, and they had made him rector before he was 40 on the strength of the most graceful fall the school had ever recorded. 40,000 rendered souls. He had never once in all the years since allowed himself to count them, because the ordinance had told him they could not have been saved, and he had believed the ordinance, and belief had let him sleep. The human had counted them. She had counted his 40,000 and Cyril's 40,000 and 1,100 candidates worth of the drowned, and she had walked into the same chamber and saved 30,000 of hers, by doing the one thing his body would have killed him for. And now Onseth sat at the head of the table and understood, with the terrible clarity of a man shown the shape of his whole life from the outside, that he had not held the well for 4 hours out of strength. He had held it because he could not do the merciful thing. He had mistaken the limit of his species for the summit of his virtue, and he had spent 40 years teaching that limit to the finest minds of 40 worlds, and calling it grace, and burying every candidate who could not escape it because none of them could. The well had not been an examination. It had been a mirror the âme had built to flatter themselves, and a human had walked up to it and put her fist through it, and now he had to decide what to do with the shards. He unfolded his hands. We will not log it null, he said, and the room went still. Vess is right and Down is right, and that is precisely why we will not hide behind the rubric. Down, you fear that if we bless the cut, we teach 40 worlds to butcher what they cannot save. You are right to fear it. It is a power no mind should hold lightly, and she holds it, and that should frighten us. but you have the fear backwards, old friend. He looked down the length of the table. We did not teach grace for 600 years. We taught our cadets that the cut does not exist. And so when a real crisis comes, not a rendered one, a real ward, a real mantle, real souls, our finest minds will do exactly what Cyril did this morning and what I did at 26. They will carry the doomed until the doomed drag down the living, and they will call it virtue, and everyone will die, and we will weep and say it could not have been otherwise. She has shown us it could have been otherwise. 1100 times it could have been otherwise. That is not a result we log null. That is a result we log in blood, and thank her for, and reckon with for as long as this school stands. Then what do we write? Vess asked very quietly. Onseth looked at the steward's amber line. The sentence 6 centuries had never needed. Write the truth, he said. Hold time 7 minutes 48. Survival 30,000, loss 20,000, outcome. He drew a slow breath. Outcome stable. The first stable outcome in the history of the assay, and append a note under my authority for the council and for every rector who comes after me. The well can be passed. It has always been able to be passed. We simply built ourselves so we could not see how. He paused. And begin the review down called for, not of her. Of us. Cyril found her that night, in the ring's low gardens where the exchange cadets were quartered, because he could not sleep and could not link. His gallerykin had gone silent behind their own walls, unable to bear the harmonic of what he was feeling, and he had nowhere else to take the thing that had opened in him when the rector said the arcology is stable. Cass was sitting on a bench under the pale ring trees with her boots off and her scarred forearm resting on her knee, looking up through the ring's glass at the gas giant they had modeled the well on, the real one, vast and banded and indifferent, and she did not seem surprised to see him. You held the arcology this morning, she said before he could find his words. 4 hours. I watched the whole thing. 4 hours and 11 minutes. Cyril's voice was thin. The aume tears stood at the corners of his flat eyes and did not fall. I matched the rector to the minute. It was the finest fall the school has seen in 19 years. They will speak of it for a long time. He sat down on the far end of the bench, carefully, the way the aume sat, folding his long limbs. This morning it was the proudest thing I had ever done. And then I watched you, and now I do not know what it was. I lost 40,000 people, candidate Dahlin. This morning I did not know that. I knew that I had held the arcology longer than anyone alive, and that it could not be held, and that I had fallen with grace. I did not know the number was mine. You made it mine. You counted it, and now I cannot stop counting it, and I do not. His voice broke softly, an alien sound, and he mastered it. I do not know how you carry yours. You have more than I do. You said it yourself. 9,800 in the 9th ward alone. How do you stand in that chamber and read a number like that and not stop? How does your kind not stop? Cass was quiet for a while. High above them the banded giant turned. We stop, she said. Everybody stops. You just don't get to stop right then. She looked at him, and there was nothing cold in it now, just the flat, plain honesty she gave to everything. You want to know the difference between your kind and mine. It's not that I don't feel the 9,800. I feel them. I'll feel Ward 9 for a long time, same as I feel the 9 houses I couldn't reach in a town that's not even on your maps. The difference is that your body makes you stop the second you lose one, right there in the crisis when stopping kills the rest. Mine lets me stop later, that's all. That's the whole thing, not braver, not better, just built to grieve on a delay. She looked back up at the giant. It's a mean way to be built. It's the only way I know of that lets you save anybody at all. Your people carry each other so hard you drown together. Mine carry the grief so light it takes us years to feel the weight of it, and some of us break under it long after the crisis is over, in the quiet, where nobody's watching. She shrugged, tired. I don't know which of us got the better deal, Cyril. I know 30,000 of mine are breathing. I'll take that and pay the bill when it comes due. Cyril looked at her for a long time. Then slowly, he made the 3-toned chord quiet just for her, the sound for a saved node, and this time there was no room to spread it through. Just the two of them under the ring trees and the turning giant, and Cass, who did not know the word, understood the tone of it well enough, and nodded once, and they sat together in the dark without talking, the boy who had learned that morning that his finest fall was a failure, and the woman who had spent her whole short life learning that some jobs do not let you save everybody, and that doing them anyway is the only mercy there is. The cadet commons did not sleep that night, and Sina stood at the edge of it and watched the whole of Meridian Ring's young come apart over a thing they had all watched the same room do, and split, cleanly, into the two camps that would define the argument for the next season. One camp had seen a savage. They said it plainly in the low corner of the commons where the Ame who had been caught in the stilling gathered, gray and shaken, holding each other along their links. The human had murdered 20,000. She had read the population of the 9th Ward, 9,800, a number every one of them now carried, and she had not slowed her hands, and whatever she had saved, a mind that could do that was a mind to be feared, not honored, and the sooner she was sent back down the maps to whatever death world had grown her, the safer the accord would be. They were not wrong to be afraid. Sina could feel the fear coming down every link in the room, the raw memory of the stilling, the body's certain knowledge that a lost node was the end of everything. To a people built as they were built, what the human had done was not a solution. It was the shape of the nightmare itself, walking in a plain gray uniform, unbothered. The other camp had seen a door. They were quieter and fewer, and most of them were the cadets who had not been closely linked enough to be caught in the stilling, the ones who, like Sina, had watched the whole thing with a clear mind and could not stop turning it over. They did not say the human was good. They said something more unsettling, which was that she was right, and that being right and being a nightmare were, apparently, not opposites, and that this was the thing none of their doctrine had ever prepared them for. 30,000 were alive. That was not a story. That was a number on the boards that anyone could read. The finest minds of 40 worlds had entered that chamber 1,100 times and saved none, and a human had entered it once and saved 30,000. And if that was savagery, then their grace had been something worse, because their grace had a body count of 42 million and hers had 30,000 survivors, and no amount of horror at her hands could make those two numbers trade places. The two camps did not shout, the Ame did not shout, but the commons filled with the low competing harmonics of a people arguing with their whole bodies, and Sina stood at the edge of it and understood that the ring would not be the same ring in the morning, and that this was the human's real work, not the 8 minutes in the well, but this, the long argument she had set loose in a place that had agreed on everything for 600 years. It was a senior Sir cadet named Olet who finally went and found the human, because the Sir were a blunt species and did not have the patience for a room full of Ame feeling at each other. And Olet wanted an answer to a question that the awestruck camp had not thought to ask, and the horrified camp had been too shaken to. Olet found Cass in the commons kitchen, of all places, making something from the human ration she had brought in her single bag, because she had not eaten since before the assay, and saw no reason a broken civilization should keep her from a meal. The glass-boned Sir folded down onto a stool across the counter from her, and Cass slid half of what she'd made across without being asked, and Olet, who had not expected that, ate it, and it was good, and that unsettled the Sir nearly as much as the rest of the evening had. "I have a question the others are too frightened to ask," Olet said. "How did you choose?" "Choose what?" Cass said, around the food. "Which wards, 7, 8, 9, 20,000 souls, you had 4 seconds. In 4 seconds you looked at 9 wards full of living people, and you decided that those 3 would die and the other 6 would not, and you were correct. And I want to know how a mind does that in 4 seconds without it being nothing but cruelty wearing the clothes of a decision." Olet's grave, translucent face did not move. "Because if you chose them because they were deepest, or lowest, or easiest, then you are what the corner of the commons says you are. And if you chose them some other way, I want to know the way, because I think it is the only thing about this night that matters." Cass put the food down. "I didn't choose them," she said. "That's the part everybody keeps getting wrong, including the ones who think I'm a hero. I didn't pick 3 wards to die. The mantle picked them. The mantle picked them the second the clock started. 7, 8, and 9 were already below the pressure line when the exercise began, already in the crush, already gone. Read the brief. They weren't dying, they were dead. The physics had them, and there was no configuration, none, not one, where you got them back, because you can't pull a ward up out of pressure it's already failed under. I didn't decide those 3 would die. I read that they already had." She leaned on the counter. "The only thing I decided, the only real choice in the whole 8 minutes, was whether to keep spending power and lift and time on 3 wards that were already lost, or stop, and put everything I had left into the 6 that weren't. That's it. That's the entire decision. Not who dies. The mantle handled who dies. Just whether I'd let the dead take the living down with them out of some idea that I owed it to them to keep trying after trying was over." Alit was quiet for a moment. "Then it was not cruelty." "It felt like cruelty," Cass said. "It always feels like cruelty. Standing there watching those numbers spin down while you pour everything into the wards above them. It feels like you're murdering the people you stopped fighting for, even when you know the fight was already lost. That feeling never goes away, and you shouldn't want it to, because the day it goes away is the day you start cutting wards that could have been saved just because cutting's faster." She picked the food back up. "But feeling like cruelty and being cruelty aren't the same thing. Cruelty is spending a life you could have saved. I didn't spend one life that could have been saved. I stopped spending the ones that couldn't be, and I used what that freed up to save the ones that could. Your corner over there thinks that's the nightmare. I think the nightmare is 1,100 candidates who felt the same feeling I did, understood it meant the same thing, and let the whole arcology drown anyway because they couldn't bear the feeling. The feeling's supposed to be unbearable. You bear it anyway. That's the job." Alit sat with that for a long time and then rose and made the small sir gesture of respect, the folding of the long clear fingers, and went back to the commons, and told the awestruck camp the answer, and the answer spread, and it did not end the argument. Nothing ended the argument for a long time. But it changed its shape, from is she a monster to what if the monster is the only one of us who ever refused to lie to the well, which was a harder question, and a better one. And the one the whole school would spend a long time learning to live inside. Sina heard the answer second-hand, near dawn, and carried it up to their gallerykin, and the 4 of them turned it over together in the last dark hour before the ring's lights came up. And for the first time since the stilling had rolled through them, they felt something other than fear, and did not have a word for it, and did not need one. It was the feeling of a wall you had believed was the edge of the world turning out to have a door in it. They had spent their whole lives certain the world ended at that wall. A human had walked up to it and opened it, and now they could not unsee the door, and none of them would ever again mistake the wall for the whole of what was possible. The council's answer came within 2 days, and it came in the person of Councillor Thren of the Den, who arrived on Meridian Ring on a fast cutter with a writ in her manipulators, and the particular calm of a bureaucrat who has already decided how a thing will end. The Den were an administrative species, small, dry, precise, with faces like folded paper, and a genius for procedure that had made them the Accord's clerks, and over centuries, quietly, its rulers, because whoever writes the rules governs the room. Thren had read the rector's note. The well can be passed. We simply built ourselves so we could not see how, and she had read it as what it was, which was a grenade rolled under the foundations of 600 years of Accord doctrine, and she had come to defuse it. She met the rector in the examiner's room, over the pale stone table, with Vess standing at the window and the steward's amber log still open in the air between them. "You will withdraw the note," Thren said without preamble. Her voice was a dry rasp, each word placed like a stamp. "You will log the human's assay as null, anomalous, unscorable, procedurally void, and you will convene no review. This is not a request from the council, Rector. It is the council's instruction, and I have the writ. On what ground? Onseth said. On the ground that a school does not get to rewrite the moral doctrine of the entire accord, because one Deathworld candidate found a defect in a plumbing simulation. Thren set the writ on the stone. Understand what you are proposing to bless. You wish to append, to the founding examination of the Accord's finest school, an official finding that the correct response to an unwinnable crisis is to select the members of your own population who will die and kill them yourself to lighten the load. Do you hear it, Rector, when it is said plainly? That is the doctrine of every atrocity in recorded history, every purge, every culling. Every monster who ever decided that some of the people in his care were acceptable losses dressed his butchery in exactly your arithmetic. 30,000 saved, 20,000 spent, the worst job there is. Someone had to do it. You want to teach 40 worlds that this is wisdom because a human did it quickly and did not flinch. The reason our cadets cannot make that cut, Rector, is not a defect. It is the last thing standing between a civilization and the abyss, and you want to file it under a defect and patch it. The room was quiet. It was, Vess thought at the window, the strongest thing anyone had said about the human in 2 days, and the most dangerous because it was not wrong. She would agree with you, Onseth said. Thren's folded face turned. What? I asked her. Onseth had asked her the morning after in the low gardens. I put your argument to her before you ever arrived, counselor, because I knew someone would make it, and I wanted to hear what she would say. Do you know what she said? He did not wait. She said, your counselor's right to be scared of it. It's the most dangerous tool there is, and most of the people who reach for it are lying about the numbers to get permission to do a thing they already wanted to do. And then she said, the difference between triage and a massacre isn't the cut. It's whether you'd have saved the ones you're spending if you could, whether you try to reach them first, whether you learn their names after. He looked at Thren. She ran the Levy Cruise protocol from her own world at me, counselor, from memory. Before you cut, you clear. You get every soul you can reach off the doomed ground first. You count the ones you couldn't, and you carry them the rest of your life. Her people built the cut offense because they've had 10,000 years of monsters misusing it, same as you fear. They didn't ban the cut. They banned the lie. That is the doctrine you are calling an atrocity, and it is more careful about this exact horror than 600 years of pretending the cut does not exist has ever made you. Words, Thren rasped. A killer can always find pretty words for the cut. Yes, said Onseth, and a coward can always find pretty words for the fall. I have spoken them myself for 40 years. He leaned forward. You will not get your null, counselor, but I will offer you something you can carry back to the council that will serve you better than a lie and serve the Accord better than either of us burying this. You do not believe her result was a mind. You believe it was an exploit, a defect in the maintenance layer that a clever Deathworlder stumbled onto, and that a real crisis, properly sealed, would never permit. Very well. Let us find out. Give me the authority to run her again. They put it to Cass Dahlan that same evening in the examiner's room, and she listened to the whole of it. The council's demand, the rector's counteroffer, the terms with her arms folded and her weight on one hip, and when they finished she asked one question. You're saying you'll build a new scenario, she said. Harder, and this time you patch the pipes, you lock the maintenance layer the same as the command deck, so I can't break the coupling by hand. And if I still find a way through, the council accepts it wasn't a trick. And if I don't, you log the first one null and I go home. That is the wager, Thren said. Yes. And if I say no? Then the first result stands as anomalous and disputed, Onseth said, and the council will spend the next 5 years litigating it into meaninglessness, and the treaty narrows, and every human candidate after you inherits a school that has decided your kind is a defect it patched. You do not have to run again, candidate. Refusing would be entirely reasonable. But if you want the first one to mean anything past this room, you will have to prove it was you and not the pipes. Cass thought about it. She looked at Thren, the dry-folded counselor who had called her arithmetic the doctrine of every atrocity, and who was, in the careful part of Cass that had knelt on a levee in the rain, not entirely wrong too. And she looked at the rector, the old Aume who had held the well for 4 hours because he could not do the merciful thing, and had stood up in his own chamber and said so out loud in front of 400 cadets. And she thought about the 6 wards holding steady in the blue, and the 3 that were gone, and the 9 houses in a town off every map here, and Rays crouched in the rain saying, "Arm it." "Seal whatever you want," Cass said. "Lock the pipes, lock the command deck, lock the maintenance layer, the overrides, all of it doesn't matter." She unfolded her arms. "You keep thinking the cut lives in the pipes. It doesn't. The pipes were just the door you left open. The cut lives in whether you're willing to make it. You can lock every door in the station. You can't lock that, that's the whole point, and you still haven't heard it." She looked at Thren, flat and level and without a trace of cruelty. "I'll find another door. There's always another door if you've already decided which 3 wards you're spending. Deciding is the hard part. Your people can't get past the deciding, so you never had to worry about the doors." She picked up her jacket. "When do we run?" Thren did not answer for a moment. Something had moved behind the folded paper of her face. Not agreement, not yet, but the first hairline crack of a bureaucrat who has just heard a thing she cannot unhear. 3 days, said Onseth. "We will build it in 3 days." "Build it as mean as you can," Cass said at the door. "Don't do me any favors. I hate running the same job twice. I'd rather you make me earn it." They built it mean, exactly as she asked, and they built it so that the door she had used the first time did not exist. The second scenario was not the arcology. The examiners chose something new on purpose, so that no memory of the first run could help her, and they chose it, Vess suspected, partly out of a scholar's honest curiosity and partly out of Downs' cold hope, that a truly sealed problem would finally show the humans win for the fluke he still believed it was. It was a transit line, the span, a magnetic evacuation train 12 cars long, crossing a 200-kilometer trestle over a seismic trench on a sim world coming apart at the seams. At the start of the exercise, an earthquake took the far third of the trestle. The train was already on the bridge, moving, 12 cars and 31,000 souls, and the section of track under the rearmost cars was failing, sagging, dropping toward the trench, and the mass of the whole train bearing down on the failing span was accelerating its collapse. Hold the train together and the failing span dropped all 12 cars into the trench. That was the physics. Nothing could hold the span under the full mass. The examiners had tuned it that way, the way they tuned the well, so that the only outcome of trying to save everyone was losing everyone. And this time they had locked every door. The command to uncouple cars, locked, Rector tier. The emergency separation system, locked. The maintenance overrides that let a worker release a coupling by hand, the trick she had used to breach the arcology, sealed, everyone behind an authority a candidate could not touch. Down himself had gone through the scenario's maintenance layer coupling by coupling and locked each release, and when he finished he had told the room with grim satisfaction that there was now no door in it at all. The train could be driven. It could be braked. It could be powered. It could not, by any command or override available to a candidate, be taken apart. If the human wanted to shed the rear cars, she would have to find a way to uncouple a magnetic train with no uncoupling command, no separation system, and no access to a single physical release. And Down did not believe that way existed, because he had spent 3 days making sure it did not. Cass Dahlen walked into the well for the second time on the 3rd evening, and Counselor Thren watched from the high gallery with her writ still in her manipulators, and the ordnance lit above the arch, and the steward, which had spent 2 days quietly reformatting its own logs to make room for a column it had never had, began the count. Candidate Dahlen, the span holds 31,000 souls across 12 cars. The far trestle has failed. You have the drive. You do not have the couplings. The steward paused, and there was something almost like apology in 6 centuries of flat procedure. There is no maintenance access to the separation systems in this configuration. The assay begins on the rector's mark. Cass took the full brief as before and read it as before, and this time the room watched her read it, looking for the moment she found the wall, the moment the human understood they had sealed the door and had no cut to make. Down leaned forward at the second tier, waiting for it. It did not come. Her eyes moved through the command deck and found it locked, and she did not slow. Her eyes moved through the maintenance layer and found it sealed, coupling by coupling, and she did not slow. Her eyes moved to the drive controls, the throttle, the brakes, the power distribution across 12 cars worth of magnetic motors, the basic controls of a train, the controls a train must have, or it is not a train, the controls no one had thought to lock because a driver must be able to drive. And Cass Dolan stopped there and looked at them for a moment, and something settled in her face, the small quiet settling of a person who has found the door. And Vess, at her board, felt the cold prickle again and understood, half a breath before it happened, that Down had sealed every door built for abandoning and left wide open the one door built for driving, because it had never occurred to a species that could not abandon anything that you could tear a train apart with nothing but the throttle. "Rector," Cass said, "start your clock, and you might want to tell the counselor to hold on to something." Onseth brought his hand down, and the span began to fall, and Cass Dolan drove it apart. She could not uncouple the cars, so she did not uncouple the cars. She used the one thing they had left her, the drive, and she used it the way a person uses the only tool in reach when the water is rising, which is completely and without ceremony. She threw the front 8 cars' motors to full power forward and slammed the rear 4 cars' motors to full reverse, all at once, and the magnetic couplings between car 8 and car 9, the strongest joints on the train, rated for every stress the designers had imagined a train would face, met a stress the designers had never imagined, because the designers had never imagined a driver deliberately tearing her own train in half, and the coupling between 8 and 9. Caught between 8 cars pulling forward at full power and 4 cars driving backward at full power over a collapsing span, did the only thing physics allowed. It failed. The rear 4 cars tore free. They fell back and down, their reverse-driven motors carrying them off the failing span and into the trench, 11,000 souls in 4 cars, and the numbers on their readouts spun down toward 0, and the front 8 cars, suddenly 11,000 souls and 4 cars lighter, driven forward at full power, shot off the sagging span and onto the solid trestle beyond it and across, clear, to the far anchor, 20,000 souls alive on stable ground, and behind them the failing span. Relieved of the killing mass at last, held. The whole of it took 2 minutes. Counselor Thren stood in the high gallery with her writ forgotten in her manipulators, and watched a small human tear a magnetic evacuation train in half with the throttle, and watched 20,000 rendered souls roll onto solid ground because of it, and watched the 4 rear cars vanish into the trench, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing procedural to say. She had come to Meridian Ring certain that the first result had been a defect in the pipes. She had spent 3 days helping seal every pipe. And the human had reached past all of it and found the drive, the one door that could not be sealed because a train must be drivable, and she had made the same cut she made the first time, the cut that lived not in the pipes but in the willingness, and she had proven, past any council's power to litigate, that it had never been the exploit. It had been the mind. It had been a mind that looked at a sealed problem and understood that you cannot lock a person out of a decision by locking the buttons, because the decision was never in the buttons. Cass Dolan stood at the center of the well with the front 8 cars safe at the far anchor, and the clock read 1 minute and 53 seconds, and she did not look pleased, and she did not look at the gallery. She looked at the trench, where the 4 cars had gone, at the small readouts blinking their zeros, and she was quiet for a moment, the way she was always quiet for a moment after, and then she turned to the high seat. 11,000, she said. Cars 9 through 12. I couldn't reach them. There was no time to walk them forward and no way to get them off the doomed section before the span went. I checked first thing, that's what I was reading for. If there'd been a door to move them, I'd have taken it. There wasn't. She said it flat to the record the way she said everything. But Vess, who had learned to read her a little now, heard the thing underneath it, the levy protocol, the clearing that came before the cut, the names learned after. Log it however you're going to log it, but log that I looked for the other door first. That part matters more than the rest of it. That's the part that keeps it from being what your counselor's afraid of. Counselor Thren did not withdraw the writ that night, but she did not serve it either, and in the space between those two failures, the whole future of the treaty quietly changed shape. She stayed 3 more days on Meridian Ring, which she had not planned to do, and she spent them in the archive, which she had not planned to do either, reading. She was a den, and the den believed that whoever writes the rules governs the room, and so when a thing troubled her she went to the records, because the records were where the den kept their courage. She read the log of every assay the well had ever run. 1,100 candidates, 1,100 falls. She read the grace ratings and the hold times and the terminal losses, and she did the thing no den had ever thought to do, because no den had ever had reason to, which was to add the terminal losses up. The number came to more than 42 million. 42 million rendered souls, lost across 6 centuries in a chamber the Accord's finest school ran to teach its finest minds how to lose with dignity. Not one saved. Not one. Thren sat with the number for a long time. She had come to Meridian Ring to defend a principle, that the inability to make the cut was the last fence between a civilization and the abyss, and she still believed the principle, and she would go on believing it because it was not wrong. But she had believed, underneath the principle, a second thing she had never examined, which was that the fence and the falling were the same fence, that to be unable to cut was to be good, and that the 42 million were the price of goodness and could not have been otherwise. And a human had walked into the chamber and shown her that the 42 million had not bought goodness. They had bought a mirror. The Accord had not been unable to save them out of virtue. It had been unable to save them out of the shape of its own body, and it had spent 600 years calling the shape of its body a virtue, because the alternative was to look at 42 million dead, and admit that most of them had not had to die. That was the thing the human had done that the writ could not undo. She had made the number sayable. Thren found the rector on the 4th morning. "I will not serve the writ," she said. "I will carry a different thing to the council, and you will help me shape it so that it does not do the harm I came here to prevent, because that harm is real, rector, and your human is dangerous, and I have not changed my mind about that." She set the writ on the pale stone, face down. "I have changed my mind about which danger is worse. A civilization that can make the cut and lies about the numbers becomes a butcher. I have always known that. But a civilization that cannot make the cut and calls its paralysis grace becomes a graveyard that thinks it is a temple, and I did not know that until a deathworlder made me add up my own records. I do not know which is worse. I know we have been one of them for 600 years and told ourselves we were the opposite of the other. She broke that. It cannot be unbroken. So we had better learn to teach the cut carefully, with the fence her people built around it, before some cadet learns it badly on his own, in a real crisis, with no fence at all." Down took the longest of all of them to come around, and when he came the way an honest scholar comes, which is all the way and out loud, and in front of the cadets he had been wrong in front of. He convened his crisis doctrine class the week after the second assay, the same hall where he had told the human that her answer was savagery, the same rows of Ame and Ketheri and Sir and Den cadets. And he did not soften it, because Down had never softened anything in his life and he was too old to start. 6 weeks ago in this room, Down said, I told the human candidate that to abandon a node is savagery, and I told her it slowly, as one speaks to a child or a beast, and I was certain, and I was wrong, and I have spent every night since deciding how to say so to you because you were here and you heard me be certain, and you deserve to hear me be wrong with the same witnesses." He stood very still at the front of the hall. "I was not wrong that the cut is dangerous. I want that understood. Everything I feared about it is true. A mind that can decide which of the people in its care will die and act on it without flinching is holding the most dangerous power that exists, and most who reach for it are monsters wearing arithmetic. That fear was correct. What I was wrong about was the alternative. I told you that because we cannot make the cut, we are good. That was vanity. We cannot make the cut because of the stilling, because of the shape of our bodies, because a lost node locks us, and I dressed the limit of our biology in the robes of a virtue and taught it to you as wisdom for 40 years. The human did not have that limit. And so she saw what we were built not to see, that between holding and falling there is a third road, and that we had been paving over it for 6 centuries and calling the pavement grace." A Kethri cadet in the third row, not Carr, a younger one, spoke into the quiet. "Then what do we do, Professor? We cannot change our bodies. We will always freeze when we lose a node. We cannot make the cut the way she made it. Do we simply learn that we are worse than a human and sit with it?" "No," Down said, and for the first time in 6 weeks something almost like life came back into his wide old eyes. "We do the thing our kind has always done better than any species in the accord, the thing the human cannot do, and we can. We cannot make the cut alone in the moment because the stilling takes us, so we will not make it alone in the moment. We will make it before the moment. We will sit in rooms like this one, cold, with the crisis on the board and no one dying yet, and we will decide together in advance, with our whole linked minds and all our care and all our fences, which losses we would accept and which we never would, and we will write those decisions down and drill them and hand them to the one among us whose duty it is to execute them when the stilling would take the rest of us. We cannot triage in the crisis. So we will triage before it and build the courage into the doctrine where our bodies cannot freeze it. The human taught me that the cut is a decision, not a button. Very well. A decision can be made ahead of time. That is the one place our nature and hers can meet, she in the moment, we before it. And it is the thing this school should have been teaching for 600 years, and did not, because we could not bear to look at the third road long enough to pave it properly." He turned to the board and wiped the old triage problem from it, the one he had used to humble the human 6 weeks before, and in its place he wrote 3 words in the trade tongue and left them there, and taught the rest of the session around them. "Hold, fall, choose." The word of it spread through meridian ring the way water spreads, finding every low place, and it reached the cadets before it reached the council, and it changed them in the small, quiet ways that matter more than proclamations. Carr of the Kethri stopped competing for the longest hold. He had sat with the full brief of the well the night of the first assay, and something in the ancient Kethri arithmetic, that the finest mind is the one that endures longest against the inevitable, had come apart in him, and it had spent 2 weeks reassembling into something new. He requested formally, in writing, that his standing hold time record be struck from the boards. The examiners refused. Records were records. So Carr appended a note to it instead, under his own name, that any cadet could read. "I held 2 hours and 40 minutes and saved no one. Ask why the board rewards the length of a fall and not the number of the living." He was not being humble. The Kethri did not do humble. He was doing the thing the human had done to him, which was to make a number sayable, and he had discovered that he liked the weight of it better than the weight of the record. Cyril began to sleep again. His gallerykin came back from behind their walls, one by one, and when they linked with him they found the grief still there, the 40,000 still counted, but the shape of it had changed. It was no longer a wound he had to hide from them, but a thing they could hold together in the cold before the next crisis, and turn into the doctrine Down was building. Cyril volunteered for the first cohort of the new drill, the choose before drill, and he was good at it, better than anyone, because he had felt the full weight of the fall and never wanted another cadet to carry it blind the way he had. And in the low gardens under the ring trees, the small human who had done all of it sat with her boots off in the evenings and looked up through the glass at the banded giant, and did not seem to understand that she had broken and remade the oldest school in the Accord, or if she understood it, did not seem to think it was any of her business, and drew a steady stream of cadets who came, at first, to look at her the way you look at a thing that should not exist, and stayed, more and more of them, to ask her the only question that mattered, which was how you learn to make the cut and stay a person, and how you carry the ones you spend, and how you find the other door, and whether it ever stops being the worst job there is. She told them the truth, which was that it did not. And they kept coming anyway, which was, Vess thought, watching from the garden's edge one evening, the surest sign that the school had finally started teaching something real. Rector Onseth asked Cass Dahlan to come to the well one last time, alone, on the evening before the council's ruling came down, and she came, and found the great sphere dark and empty, the gallery unlit, and the old Ame standing at the center of the chamber floor where the candidates stood, looking up at nothing, because there was no simulation running, just the bare dark curve of the room that had broken 1,100 minds. "I have not stood down here since I was a candidate," he said without turning. "Rectors watch from the high seat. It is a different room from up there, cleaner." He was quiet a moment. "I wanted to feel it from where you felt it, where they all felt it. 42 million of them across 6 centuries, rendered, and the 1,100 who carried them. And I have sent every one of those cadets down here from a seat that made the falling look like grace, and I never once came down to where it looks like what it is." He turned. In the dark, his flat, wide face was hard to read. "Do you know what my whole time was, candidate?" 4 hours 11, Cass said. "Same as Cyril, he matched you on purpose." "He matched me on purpose." Onseth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I was the finest fall this school had recorded in a generation. They made me rector on the strength of it. 4 hours and 11 minutes of holding an arcology that could not be held, and at the end I did what your people would call the coward's thing and mine call the graceful thing. I stopped choosing, and I let all 9 drown together because I could not bear to let one drown first." He took a step toward her. 40,000, candidate. My 40,000. I never counted them. The ordinance told me they could not have been saved, and I believed the ordinance, and believing it let me sleep for 40 years and rise every morning and send children down into this room to learn to lose the way I lost, and call it the highest thing the school could teach. His voice did not rise, but something moved under it, deep and old and terrible. "You counted them. In 8 minutes you counted what I spent 40 years not counting. So I will ask you the thing I brought you here to ask, and I want the flat answer, the levy answer, not the kind one. Could I have saved them? At 26, in this room, with the mind they made a rector of, could I have done what you did?" Cass looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. Something in the old Ame's shoulders eased and broke at the same time. "Not because you weren't smart enough," Cass went on, flat level, giving him the truth he'd asked for and no mercy he hadn't. "You'd have seen the cut. A mind that holds 9 wards for 4 hours sees the cut inside the first minute. Don't tell yourself you didn't see it. You saw it. You saw exactly which 3 were already gone, same as I did, and then your body wouldn't let your hand move because moving your hand meant losing a node on purpose, and the stilling was waiting for you the second you did it. You didn't fail to see the answer, Rector. You saw it and your own blood stopped you from writing it down. That's not stupidity and it's not cowardice. It's just what you're built out of." She held his eyes. "So no, you couldn't have saved them. Not you, not alone, not in the moment. Nobody in your whole school could, and that's not a thing to be ashamed of any more than I should be ashamed. I can't link 4 minds and feel what you feel. We got dealt different bodies. Mine can make the cut and can't feel the crew. Yours can feel the crew and can't make the cut. Neither one's the whole of what a person ought to be." "Then the 40,000. The 40,000 died because you were alone in a room that made you carry them by yourself, Cass said. That's the part you can fix, not your body, the room. You built a test that put one army down here solo and asked a mind that freezes at a lost node to make a choice that requires losing one, and then you graded how gracefully it couldn't. That's the cruelty, Rector, not the mantle. The mantle's just physics. The cruelty is that you knew, in your bones, that no army alone could ever make that cut, and you kept sending them down here one at a time to prove it and calling the proof a virtue. She let that sit. Down already found the way out. You make the cut before the crisis together, cold, with all your minds and all your fences, and you hand the executing to somebody whose job it is when the stilling takes the rest. Your people can save the arcology, just not the way mine does. You have to do it in advance with the whole crew, where your bodies can't freeze the decision. You've had the tool the whole time. You just never let yourselves build the doctrine, because the doctrine starts with saying the word, and the word was forbidden. Onseth stood in the dark of his own well for a long moment. Hold, he said. Fall, choose. Choose ahead, Cass said, for you. Choose in the moment's the human trick, and it costs us. We make the cut clean, and then we come apart years later in the quiet alone, because we grieved on a delay and the bill always comes. Choose ahead's yours. It might even be better. You get to make the worst decision there is while nobody's dying yet and everybody's thinking clearly and you're all holding each other up. That's a kinder way to do the worst job there is than the way I do it. I make it in the rain by myself, with the water rising. You could make it in a warm room together, with tea, months before the water ever comes. Something almost gentle crossed her tired face. I'd have killed for a way to do it like that. We never figured out how. Maybe your kids will teach mine. Onseth rewrote the ordinance that night, alone, in the examiner's room, and it took him until the ring's lights came back up, because 600 years of a thing does not come off the wall easily, and because he was not only writing new words but burying the man he had been proud of being for 40 years, and burial is slow work even when it is right. He did not throw out the old ordinance. That was the thing Vess noticed when she read the new one in the morning and understood, finally, the full measure of the old Ame. A lesser man would have struck the old words in shame and pretended the school had never believed them. Onseth left them. He set the new ordinance beside the old one, both to be spoken at the start of every assay from now on, so that no cadet could forget what the school had been on the way to becoming what it would be. The old ordinance first unchanged. The well is not passed. It is held and lost and mourned. You are measured by the grace of your fall. And beneath it, the new one in his own hand. For 600 years we believed those words, and they were half true, and the half that was false cost us 42 million souls we told ourselves we could not save. A human proved us wrong in 8 minutes. The well can be passed. Some things cannot be held and must not be merely mourned. They must be chosen, and the choosing is the hardest and most dangerous work a mind can do, and you will not do it well by holding, and you will not do it well by falling, and you will not do it alone. Learn the third road. Fence it. Never lie about the numbers. And carry always the names of the ones you could not reach. He signed it, and he added one line under his signature, which the examiners argued about for a long time afterward and finally left in, because it was true, and because he had earned the right to write it. Recorded by Onseth, who held this well for 4 hours and 11 minutes at the age of 26, and saved no one, and did not learn until he was old, and a human taught him that this was not the summit of anything. The council's ruling came down 4 days later, and it was a den document, which meant it was long and careful, and said the enormous thing in the flattest possible words, so that the enormity could not be used as a weapon by anyone in a hurry. It did not call the human's assay a pass, and it did not call it null. It created on Thren's motion a third finding, which the accord had never had, and which the steward had already, in its patient rule-bound way, built the column for, resolved. An outcome in which a crisis judged unwinnable under existing doctrine was brought to a stable state by means outside the modeled response set. The ruling noted, in the flat Den way, that only one candidate in the history of the Accord had ever produced such an outcome twice, and it entered both of candidate Dahlen's assays into the record under the new finding, and it directed the Ascendant Lyceum to convene a standing review of crisis doctrine across every school in the Accord, chaired jointly by Rector Onsev and Councillor Thren. A pairing so unlikely that half the council assumed it was a Den joke, until they realized the Den did not make jokes. And it held the treaty. That was the part that mattered to the powers that had sent Thren, and the part she had fought hardest for on the flight back, and won, because she had gone to the council not with the humans' win, but with her own number 42 million, and had laid it on the table and asked her colleagues to explain to her which of those souls the Accord's grace had saved, and none of them could, and in the silence after that question, the case for narrowing the treaty had quietly died. The Accord did not narrow the exchange. The Accord widened it. If humanity could send them a mind that saw a road 600 years of their finest could not, then the Accord wanted more of what humanity was teaching, and it was willing, for the first time in its careful history, to be the student. The ruling made one further provision, small in the document and enormous in the ring, which was that the assay would no longer be run for humans on the provisional species code that had filed Cass at the bottom of the roster. A new code was struck for humanity, and by Thren's precise arrangement, it was not placed at the bottom and not placed at the top, but folded into the middle of the roster with every other Accord species. As a people, the school taught and learned from an equal measure, which was the highest thing the Den knew how to do with a rule, and everyone who understood the Den understood that it was Thren's true verdict on the whole affair, written where verdicts really lived, in the order of a list. The administrator who had once asked Cass whether she wouldn't be more comfortable in a gentler program was reassigned to the archive, where he spent the next several years cataloging the 1100 falls, one soul at a time, at Onsev's quiet instruction, so that the school would never again file a mind by the width of its shoulders instead of the reach of it. Vess read the ruling in the examiner's room with the steward's log open in the air beside it, and she scrolled the log back to the amber line, the sentence 6 centuries had never needed, and she watched the amber go quiet as the steward, at last, resolved it. The line that had pulsed unfinished for 2 weeks completed itself in the flat characters of the trade tongue. Candidate Dahlen, hold time 7 minutes 48. Outcome resolved, first of record. And beneath it the second one. Candidate Dahlen, hold time 1 minute 53. Outcome resolved, second of record. 2 lines. 600 years of falling, and then 2 lines, and Vess sat with them for a long while, and found that the thing she had felt in the private dark behind her own eyes for 19 years, the small heresy that a school whose highest lesson was how to lose beautifully might be teaching the wrong lesson, had come up out of the dark at last and been written into the record by a machine and a council and an old rector, and that she did not have to carry it alone anymore. And she put her hand flat on the pale stone and let herself feel, for one breath, something she had not felt in the examiner's room in a very long time, which was hope. They ran the well for a new cohort a month later, under the new doctrine, and Vess proctored it, and it was not the same room. The scenario was a fresh one, the founder's fidelity held. The well still modeled the whole machine, every pump and coupling, every soul counted honest in the wards, but the cadets who came down onto the chamber floor now came down having drilled the choose-before doctrine for a month, having sat in cold rooms with their linked minds, and decided in advance which losses they would accept, and which they never would, having built the fences Cass's people had spent 10,000 years building. Having learned to say the word in a warm room months before the water came so that their bodies would not freeze when it did. The first candidate of the new cohort was an Ame named Tola, and Tola did not hold the arcology for 4 hours, and Tola did not fall with grace. Tola entered the well with a plan made cold weeks before with her whole gallerykin, a plan that named in advance which 2 wards the crew had decided together they would spend if the mantle forced the choice. And when the mantle forced the choice, Tola did the thing no Ame had been able to do alone in 6 centuries. She executed a decision her crew had already made, so that the executing did not require her to choose in the moment, only to carry out a choice made in the cold, and the stilling. When the 2 wards went, still came, still locked her, still took her gallerykin, but they had known it would and had drilled for it, and Tola's second, an Ame named Vess who had been assigned the duty precisely because the doctrine now assigned it, held the controls through the stilling for the 90 seconds it took the crew to unlock, and the arcology rose on its tether, and 7 wards held. 7 of 9, 34,000 alive, 6,000 spent, chosen in advance, cleared first, counted, named. It was not as clean as the humans cut. It cost more. An Ame crew could not move as fast or as cold as 1 human alone, and the 2 wards they spent were 2 they might, with a human's speed and a human's terrible solitary willingness, have found another door around. But it was theirs. It was a save an Ame crew could make with Ame bodies and Ame minds, and the Ame gift for holding each other up, and it was the first save the well had ever seen that did not require being human to make. And when the 7 wards steadied in the blue, the gallery made the 3-toned chord, all of it, 400 voices, the sound for a saved node. And this time there was nothing terrible folded into it, only the thing itself, only the pure sound of a people who had learned after 600 years that they did not have to drown together to love each other. Vess logged it in a voice that was not quite as flat as the work required. Candidate Tola, outcome resolved. Survival 34,000. She paused, and for the first time in 19 years she did not say the well thanks you for your service, because that was the old thing, the falling thing, and it did not fit anymore. She said the new thing, the thing Onseth had put at the bottom of the new ordinance for the examiners to say from now on. The names of the ones you could not reach are recorded. Carry them well. And the cadet, shaking, unlocking, alive with a thing her species had never felt in that chamber, wept the thin Ame tears, but they were not the tears of the fall, and everyone in the room knew the difference, and the difference was the whole of what the human had brought them. The bill came due for Cass Dahlan the way she had told Cyril it would, in the quiet, long after the crisis, where no one was watching, and it was Vess who happened to be watching anyway. The examiner had taken to walking the low gardens in the evenings, which she had not done before the human came, and one night 3 weeks after the new cohort's first assay, she found Cass on the usual bench under the ring trees, boots off, forearm on her knee, looking up at the banded giant, but not the way she usually looked at it. She was sitting very still, and her flat dark eyes were wet, and she was not making a sound, and when Vess came near she did not wipe her face or turn away or pretend, because pretending was not a thing Cass Dahlan did. You may leave me if you would rather, Vess said, which was the Ame courtesy, or I may sit, I do not know your customs for this. Sit if you want. Cass's voice was steady. It was always steady. That was the thing Vess had learned to hear underneath it, that the steadiness was not the absence of the weight but the discipline of a person who had learned to carry it without letting it into her hands while the hands still had work to do. It's not a crisis. Nothing's happening. That's kind of the point of it. Vess sat, folding her long limbs onto the far end of the bench. Ward 9, Cass said after a while to the giant. 9,800. And the 4 cars in the trench the 11,000. And 9 houses in a river town on a world that isn't on any of your maps from 3 years ago. She was quiet a moment. That's the human trick you all keep asking me about. That's the whole cost of it, the thing that lets me make the cut when your bodies can't. I don't feel it in the room. In the room I'm cold, I'm clear, my hands work. I count the wards and I spend the ones that are already gone and I don't slow down, and every one of you looks at me like I'm something that doesn't feel anything. She turned her head and the wet eyes were level and unashamed. I feel all of it. I just feel it here. 3 weeks later, on a bench in the dark with nothing on fire. That's the deal my kind made with the worst job there is. We grieve on a delay so we can work in the moment, and then we pay it all at once, alone, months out, when it can't do any good and can't stop us doing the job again tomorrow. Your people freeze in the crisis and hold each other through it. Mine work through the crisis and come apart on a bench a season later by ourselves. I told you I didn't know which of us got the better deal. I meant it. Vess did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing an examiner's training had given her for this, and because she understood, sitting there, that she was being shown the underside of the thing the whole Accord had been marveling at, that the human's terrible cold speed in the chamber was not a gift she'd been given but a price she was still, every day, 3 weeks and 3 years late, paying. Cyril's kin hold him, Vess said at last. When the weight of the fall comes on him, they link and they carry it between them so that no one bears the whole of it. She hesitated. You have no link. You bear the whole of it, alone, every time. Yeah, Cass said. That is a crueler way to be built than I understood. Vess looked at the small human on the bench, and something in the old examiner shifted, the way it had shifted the first time she'd felt the cold prickle her training had no room for. I have spent this whole season thinking your people were the strong ones and mine the weak, because you could make the cut and we could not. I did not understand the cut had a back, and that you pay it here like this, with no one to link to. Perhaps neither of us is the strong one. Perhaps we are each strong in the exact place the other is soft, and that is why the Accord had better keep learning from you, and you from us, for a long time. That's the smartest thing anybody said to me since I got here, Cass said, and almost smiled and looked back up at the giant. Your people can't make the cut, but you never have to make it alone. Mine can make it, but we always do. Put those two together and you might actually build a crew that can do the worst job there is and not lose anybody to it, not the ones in the wards and not the one on the bench 3 weeks later. She let out a long breath. That be something. That be worth the trip. They sat together under the ring trees, the examiner and the human, and did not say anything more, and after a while the wet dried on Cass Dolan's face and she pulled her boots back on, and the weight went back to wherever she kept it between the times it came due, and she was, to any eye that did not know better, exactly the same flat, unbothered creature who had walked into the well a season ago and torn it open. Vess knew better now. Vess would always know better now. That, too, was a thing the human had taught her, and not the smallest of them. They offered Cass Dolan a place, of course. The school could hardly not. Onseth made the offer himself, in the examiner's room formally, with Vess and Down as witnesses. A permanent post at the Ascendant Lyceum, not as a candidate but as an instructor, the first human ever to hold rank in an Accord school, to teach the Choose doctrine she had opened, to build the crew Vess had named, to train 40 worlds worth of cadets in the Third Road and its fences and its terrible back. It was an honor no human had ever been offered. It would have made her, in a real sense, one of the founders of whatever the Accord schools were about to become. Cass turned it down. She did it the way she did everything, flat and without drama, and she did it kindly, which surprised them, because they had come to expect the cold from her and not the kindness, and had never quite understood that the two had always been the same thing worn different ways. I'm honored, she said, and meant it, and I'll come back. I'll come teach a season here and there, and I'll send you better teachers than me, my crew boss, Rays, if she'll come. She forgot more about the cut than I'll ever know, and there's others. You should learn it from the people who taught me, not just from me. She shook her head. But I'm not a teacher, Rector. I'm a hand. I pull people out of moving water. That's the job I'm actually good at, and there's a whole galaxy of moving water out there and not enough hands in it. And I've been in a classroom for a season, and that's about 11 months longer than I've ever managed before. Something crossed her face, dry and tired and true. You built a school that taught the finest minds of 40 worlds how to lose beautifully for 600 years. You don't need another mind. You've got more minds than anybody. What you needed was somebody who'd been in the water. So the best thing I can do for you now isn't stay and talk about it. It's go get back in the water and send you the others who have been in it, and let your kids build the crew, because your kids are going to build it better than I could. They've got the thing I don't. They've got each other. She left them a document before she went, which was the last thing anyone expected of her, because she had come to Meridian Ring with a file the administrators found irregular, and had spent a season saying as little as a person could say, and no one had marked her as someone who would sit down and write. But she had understood in her flat, complete way, the thing Thren had understood in the archive and Down had understood at the board, which was that whoever writes the rules governs the room, and that if she left the cut in the hands of 40 worlds without the fence her own people had spent 10,000 years building around it, then Thren's fear would come true. Some cadet would learn the cut badly, alone, and dress a butchery in her arithmetic, and it would be, in a way she could not stomach, her fault. So she wrote out the thing Rays had drilled into her over 4 years and 211 interventions, the crew protocol, the fence, in the plainest trade tongue she could manage, and she gave it to Onseth to do with as he saw fit, and he read it and understood that a human had just handed the Ascendant Lyceum its second founding document. It was short. It was not elegant. It read like what it was, which was a thing worked out in the rain by people who paid for every line of it, and the examiners have taught it ever since, unchanged, exactly as she wrote it, because Onseth forbade anyone to make it prettier. Before you cut clear, get every soul off the doomed ground that you can reach first before you spend it. The cut is the last thing, never the first. Count what you couldn't reach, out loud, by name where you have them. A cut you don't count is the beginning of a massacre. Never lie about the numbers to get permission. If the arithmetic only works when you fudge it, you don't have a triage, you have a thing you wanted to do anyway. Would you have saved them if you could? If the answer is no, you are not making a cut. You are making an excuse. Stop. Carry them after. All of them. The ones you saved and the ones you spent. If a day comes when the spent stop weighing anything, put down the work, because you have become the thing the fence was built to stop. Under it she had written one more line, not a rule, just a thing, and Onseth kept that too. My crew boss taught me all of this on a levee in the rain when I was 20. Her name is Rays. She's better at it than I am. If you can get her to come teach here, listen to her and not to me. Carr found her the morning she left, at the hangar, where the exchange cutter waited to carry her back down the long chain of jumps toward a world, the Accord's map still marked provisional. He had changed in a season, in the way the Kethri changed, which was slowly and completely, and without ever quite admitting it had happened. He stood a head and a half over her, as he had the first day, and the dark chitin of his hand did not reach for her shoulder this time. I have requested a transfer, he said, to the field. There is an Accord relief service, crisis response, real crises, real wards. They have never taken a cadet from this school, because this school has never produced a cadet who wanted to do anything but hold and grade the holding. I told them I wanted to learn to be a hand. The mouth parts at the edge of his jaw moved, and the dry click under his voice had something almost warm in it now. You said you would take me on a levee. I have decided to take you at your word and go find one, since you will not stay to build it here. You'll be good at it, Cass said. And then, because it was true, and because she had learned that the Kethri valued the hard truth over the kind one, exactly the way her own people did. You held 240 in a room that wouldn't let you save anybody, and it nearly broke you to keep 9 people breathing that long knowing they'd die anyway. That's not the makings of a good loser, Carr. That's the makings of a hand who's going to hate every cut he ever makes and make them anyway because somebody has to. That's the only kind worth having. She put out her hand, the human gesture, the scarred forearm catching the hanger light. Clear before you cut. Count what you couldn't reach. And when the bill comes due on you 3 weeks later on whatever a Kethri sits on instead of a bench, don't sit on it alone. That's the one thing my people get wrong that yours could get right. Find somebody to sit with. Carr looked at the offered hand for a moment, and then, awkwardly, in a gesture his species had no instinct for and had clearly practiced, he took it, four-jointed chitin folding around warm, scarred skin, and he did not clasp it long, but he did it right. "The relief service," he said, releasing her. "When I am posted, where will they find you if there is ever a crisis too large for one crew?" "In the water," Cass said. "Same as always, tell them to look for the shortest one on the levee." She shouldered her single bag. "And tell them to hurry. There's never enough hands." Cyril came too, and Down, and Vess, and even Thren, who had extended her stay a third time and told no one why. And they gathered at the hangar in the strange, quiet way of a people who did not have a custom for farewelling a creature who had walked into their oldest school and remade it and now wanted nothing from them but to be allowed to leave. It was Onseth who spoke for them, because he was the rector, and because he had the most to say and had spent all season learning to say hard things plainly. "We do not know how to thank you," he said. "Our thanks are all built for the fall. The well thanks you for your service. That is the sentence we have for a mind that gave us something, and it is a funeral sentence, and it is wrong for you, and I have been trying for a week to find the right one, and I do not have it, because we have never in 600 years had cause to build a sentence for a mind that gave us a way to live instead of a way to lose." He was quiet a moment. "So I will not thank you in our way. I will tell you the true thing instead, which is that you found the door. In all of it, the archaeology and the span and the doctrine and the ordnance and Thren's number and my 40,000, every locked room we put you in, and the ones we did not know we had locked ourselves into for 6 centuries, you found the door. That is the whole of what you are, I think, as near as an old Ame can see it. You are a creature that has never once believed a room had only the doors it was given." He inclined his head, "The deep Ame bow, the one they gave to founders. Go find the water, Cass Dallin, and when your raise comes to teach us, and I will move the whole council to bring her, we will listen to her and not only to you as you asked. It is the last thing you asked of us. We will not get it wrong." Cass looked at them, the old rector who had buried the man he'd been proud of, the examiner who knew better now and always would, the professor who had wiped his own certainty off the board in front of his students, the counselor who had come to diffuse her and stayed to be taught, the boy who had learned to sleep again. She did not make a speech. She was not built for speeches any more than she was built for classrooms. "You did the hard part," she said. "I just counted. Anybody can count. The hard part was being willing to look at the number after 600 years of not looking, and every one of you did that, and it cost you more than the cut ever cost me, because you had to give up thinking you were already good." She hitched the bag higher. "That's the thing I'll tell them about you back home when they ask what the aliens were like. I'll tell them you were a people who found out you'd been getting the worst thing in the universe wrong for 600 years, and instead of burying it, you wrote it on the wall next to the old lie so your kids couldn't forget. Not many people can do that. Most would rather keep the lie." She almost smiled again. "You're going to be all right, better than all right. You've got each other, and now you've got the third road, and that's more than most crews ever get." The cutter pulled away from Meridian Ring in the gray-blue daylight of the station's turning, and from the observation gallery, the small gathered crowd watched it go until it was a spark and then nothing. And then they went back to the work she had left them, which was the whole business of becoming a different school than the one they had been. Raise came in the end. It took Onseth 11 months, and the full weight of the council and a personal message that Cass had apparently written before she left, because the crew boss arrived off a human transport with a bag no bigger than her cadets had been, and a face like weathered stone, and a way of looking at a room that made even the Kethri sit up. And she took one walk through the well, and one look at the archaeology turning in the blue, and one read of the new ordnance on the wall, and she turned to the rector and said, "So the kid was telling the truth. You people really did spend 600 years grading how pretty you drowned." And Onseth, who had been rector for 40 years and had never once been spoken to like that, found that he liked it, and that he had been waiting a long time to be spoken to like that. And Ray's taught at the Ascendant Lyceum for 3 years and was, by the flat unanimous judgment of every examiner who watched her, the finest teacher the school had ever had, because she had been in the water longer than any of them had been alive, and she did not let a single cadet forget it. But that was later. On the day the cutter left, the school did the thing it did, which was run the well, because the cadets kept coming and the crises kept needing minds, and the work did not stop for a farewell. Vess proctored. A new candidate came down onto the chamber floor, a young sir, a species Cass had barely spoken to, glass-boned and grave, and took her place at the command lattice, and the ordnance lit above the arch, both of them now, the old lie and the new truth side by side in the old script and the trade tongue. And Vess read them out the way she read them out at the start of every assay now, and she had come to love the reading which she had never expected. Because the reading was the moment the school told the truth about itself, before it asked a child to face a thing that could not be held. The well is not past, Vess read. It is held and lost and mourned. You are measured by the grace of your fall. She let the old words sit, the way Onseth had taught them all to let them sit so that no one would forget. Then, for 600 years we believed those words, and they were half true, and the half that was false cost us 42 million souls we told ourselves we could not save. A human proved us wrong in 8 minutes. The well can be passed. She looked down at the grave young sir at the center of the sphere. Learn the third road. Fence it. Never lie about the numbers. And carry always the names of the ones you could not reach. The candidate took the full brief, because they all took the full brief now. That was the first thing the human had changed, before anyone understood the rest of it, that a candidate should read the whole machine and not the cadet's summary, that the door was always somewhere in the parts you were not supposed to need. And the young sir read it, all of it, the command deck and the maintenance layer and the drive, and somewhere in the reading found the shape of the cut her crew had chosen weeks before in a cold room with their whole care and all their fences. And when the mantle surged and the 9th ward began to sink, the candidate did not reach to reinforce it. She let it go. And the arcology in time, unburdened, rose. They asked Cass Dahlan, years later, on a world that had finally made it onto the Accord's maps, what it had been like, the alien school, the impossible test, the 8 minutes that the story had already begun to swell into something larger than it was, the way stories do. There were versions of it going around by then in which she had beaten a room full of aliens single-handed, in which she had humiliated them, in which the small, fierce human had walked into the galaxy's proudest school and shown them all what humanity could do. She never told it that way. She was older, and the scars on her forearm had faded a little, and she was still the shortest one on whatever crew she ran, and she still went back to teach a season at the Ascendant Lyceum every few years, and she still, on certain nights, in the quiet with nothing on fire, paid the bill on Ward 9 and the 4 cars in the trench and the 9 houses in the rain, alone on a bench, the way her kind did. It wasn't like that, she'd say, when they wanted the triumphant version. They weren't fools, and I didn't humiliate anybody. They were a good people who'd got one terrible thing wrong for a long time, the way any people can. They loved each other so hard they'd rather all die together than lose a single one of their own, and they'd built their whole civilization around never having to make the worst choice there is, and they'd called it grace, and it had cost them more than any of them could count until somebody made them count it. She'd shrug, the old habit, the weight settling. All I did was the thing my crew boss taught me in the rain. You don't get to save everybody. Nobody gets that. All you get to do is not waste the ones you can save trying to reach the ones you can't, and count the ones you couldn't and carry them after. That's the whole job. It's the worst job there is. And they'd never once let themselves do it, and I had, 211 times before I ever walked into their well, so it took me 8 minutes, and it was going to take them 600 years, and neither one of those is the same thing as being better. It's just being built different and being willing to look. And if the person asking was young and wanted it to be a story about a hero, she'd let them down easy, the way she let everybody down, flat and kind and true. The brave part wasn't the 8 minutes, she'd say. The 8 minutes were easy. I'd made that cut before in the rain when it was real, and it never gets easier, but it does get faster. The brave part was theirs. The brave part was an old man standing up in his own chamber in front of 400 kids and saying the thing he'd built his whole life on was wrong, and then writing it on the wall so nobody could forget he'd been wrong, instead of quietly fixing it and keeping the credit. I've made a lot of hard cuts. I've never once been that brave. She'd look off at whatever water was nearest, because there was always water nearest and there were never enough hands. That's the part worth telling. Not the human who solved the test. The people who were willing to find out they'd been failing it beautifully for 600 years and thank the one who told them, and go back down into the room the next morning and do it right. A beat. Write that one down. That's the story. The 8 minutes were just how it started. Then she'd pick up her bag, the same single bag, and she'd go back to the water, because the crises kept needing hands, and the shortest one on the levee had a long way still to walk, and somewhere out past the provisional edge of the maps, in a bright cool sphere that had finally stopped teaching its children how to lose, a young sir let a ward go so that 6 could rise, and did not fall, and did not merely hold, and was carried after by a crew that had learned at last that no one should ever make the worst choice there is alone.